Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hey, friend, and welcome to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and I am so glad that you are listening today. And I just want to say welcome. If you are new around here, thank you for joining us here on the podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure you go ahead and click that follow button if you're listening in Apple Podcasts, or subscribe anywhere else so that you don't miss future episodes. Now, last week on the podcast, we celebrated our 3-year anniversary, and I do want to apologize about the audio. As Holly and I mentioned when we recorded, we weren't sure what was going to happen with the recording, and unfortunately, it didn't work out the way we had hoped. So we had to pull the audio from the Facebook Live that we did. So I just want to apologize for that. We're going to work on having a better setup the next time we record in person. But now let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to be hearing on today's episode. So, have you ever experienced church hurt? Have you had moments that have made you question whether you'd ever even step foot into a church again? Or maybe you've walked through just unexplainable loss that has made you wonder if God is there or if He even cares about you. If that is the case for you, friend, I just want you to know that you are not alone. And I also want to encourage you that there is hope. In today's conversation, Holly and I sit down with Nicki Koziarz to hear about her leadership journey and her story. You're going to hear Nicki's take on what it means to be a leader, what the worst form of leadership sometimes looks like, and how a deep church hurt led her into an unexpected journey of leadership. You're also going to hear how Nicki's life has been impacted by mental illness and how Nicki has seen God's faithfulness through devastating loss. Finally, we dive into how leaders can respond to others when they are experiencing doubt or loss. I know that you're going to be encouraged and blessed by this conversation with Nicki, and I really hope that you enjoy it as much as Holly and I did. Now, before we dive into the conversation, I want to share with you about today's sponsor, which is my Podcast in a Weekend mini course. Maybe you've been listening to this podcast and other podcasts for a while, and you've had that thought in the back of your mind that maybe you should start a podcast of your own. Maybe there's a message that you have that you feel God has given you to share, and this might be the time to do it, friend. I know podcasting has changed my life, and I want to help you if you decide to start a podcast yourself. So Podcast in a Weekend is a combination of strategy and shortcuts delivered in 3 workshops that are going to give you everything you need to successfully launch or relaunch a podcast. Even if you're super busy wrangling clients, writing a book, or just trying to recover from the past year. This mini course is going to help you get set up from A to Z so that you can start sharing your message with the world. So you can find out all the details about the mini course and grab it for yourself for just $37 by heading over to podcastinaweekend.com. And I'll have the link for that right in the show notes as well. So let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with Nicki. To get the show notes for this episode, you can go to estherlittlefield.com/episode 163. All right, friend, let's dive in. All right. Welcome, Nicki, to the podcast. We are so glad to have you here today with us. And we would love to get started with just if you could share a little bit about what your life and leadership look like right now.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me on here. It's such an honor to get to join you lovely ladies here today and to connect with your audience. So right now, leadership looks a little different for me than it has in years past. I was on staff at Proverbs 31 Ministries for almost a decade and just came off my official staff position about 3 years ago. And so I have been moving into, I guess, what you would call, oh, this sounds really yucky, like full-time ministry for what I do. I don't know how to say that, but it's looked a lot different. Like I've had to learn how to lead my own team. I've had to learn how to develop systems and processes. I mean, I learned so much at Proverbs, but man, it is one thing to serve under leadership than to actually be the leader of, I don't want to call this an organization, but just what I do. So I have a really small team. I don't want you guys to think like I have 20 people helping me out every day. That's not what it looks like. I really just have 2 or 3 people that work with me on a part-time basis. And so help lead them. But also I feel like I have an assignment to help lead my generation on the pursuit of truth. And so that looks like doing a lot of what we're doing here today, entering into conversations with other people and just helping them hear some of the wisdom that I've learned.
Yeah. So you do that through writing books. You have your own podcast. Is there any other spaces that you're in that you use as a vehicle to get your message out?
Yeah. So most of what I do is through speaking engagements. And so obviously COVID, we had to pivot real fast with that. Did a lot of online conferences, very over the online conferences. So grateful to head back in person with people. So I speak 2 to 3 times a month in person and do my own podcast as well. And yes, I write a book and a Bible study pretty much every 2 to 3 years. So that's really what it looks like.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about your personal life, where you live, what your family looks like? I think people like to know that stuff too. So
I'd love to. And honestly, that's way more interesting than what I do professionally. So my husband and I are first generation farmers, which is just a fancy way of saying we have no idea what we're doing. And we live just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, in a little town called Monroe. And we have 20 acres out here. And so we have been working for the past 7 years to restore this farm back to a farm. It was foreclosed on and just a really big mess. And so we've been doing that over the last 7 years. And we also have 3 daughters that are all back at home. Thank you, COVID, for that. And so that's a little bit what life looks like personally for me.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing that. I think that sometimes that gives us a little bit of insight into what your life looks like. And so I so appreciate that. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your leadership journey and when you actually realized that you were a leader and how that kind of has affected you as you've had influence in different spaces in your life.
I love that question, Holly, because I think so many people don't ever want to own that title of leader, right? Like we think it comes with thousands of followers or, all these important meetings that we have to go to and make all these major decisions. But, thankfully, I was involved at a church in my late 20s that really instilled leadership into me at that age. And, the pastor was the same age as me. And so we were just young leaders trying to figure it all out together. So they really instilled that to me in my late 20s before I ever wrote or, spoke or did anything. And for me, if you have one person listening to what you're doing and listening to any wisdom that you have to offer, you are a leader. I try to teach this to my daughters that they are not followers of this generation. They are leaders of this generation. And leadership has a high calling and a high standard. And so we are to be in this world, but we are not to be of this world as followers of Jesus. And so, that doesn't look like us standing on platforms, pointing our fingers at the world, but it's willing to sit with the world and have healthy conversations about things. And I don't know if you guys ever talk about the Enneagram on here, But I've got this 15-year-old and she is an Enneagram 8 all the way. Like, watch out if you ever cross her path. And, she sees the world very black and white. Like, there is a right way and there's a wrong way, and it's her way. Like, and so she speaks out all the time. And so I'm trying to help her develop that, like, okay, yes, but we could soften this up just a little bit. So yeah, I think leadership starts as soon as you're ready. Or even not ready, I should say.
Yeah, I love that, Nicki. And I love how you mentioned that, leadership is a high calling and it's not something to be taken lightly. And it's even something that, I've thought about just even being a podcaster, like just sharing a message of any kind with the world, that is leadership. And Absolutely. You need to take it seriously and not look at it just as like, oh, just this fun thing to do. So would you be willing to share any lessons that you've learned on your leadership journey? Because I know we always have interesting experiences as leaders, difficult things as well as good things. So maybe if there's a couple lessons you've learned in relation to how you've grown as a leader that might help our audience, we'd love to hear that.
Absolutely. So we could be here all day.
Well, that is true, but maybe let's just pick one or two.
Yeah. I will. Here's something interesting. So I'm studying Moses right now in the Bible, and Moses was one of these leaders that really argued his way into leadership. He fought it the entire way. I mean, he did not want to do this assignment. And I think one of the things, I could sit here today and tell you okay, here's my best 5 practices that I do every single day, and someone would be really interested in that. But the thing that I've really come to understand, especially this last year and a half after walking through this national crisis, worldwide crisis that we've been in, leaders have to know how to listen to God. And it's really hard sometimes as a leader because you wake up and your phone is dinging with all these notifications. And God so convicted me over the past few weeks as the world has kind of opened back up and I've been back on the road and been back out there. It's been really hard to listen to God because it's gotten really loud again. And so God has been challenging me that every morning I need to sit and I need to ask him, what are you speaking into this generation right now? What is your movement right now? Because sometimes the worst form of leadership is when it becomes about us and our agenda and our to-do list and let me tell you about my book and my podcast and things like that. No, I want to be a leader who someone looks at and goes, I can trust Nicki because I know that she listens to God. And so that's been probably the number one lesson that I've recently really gotten a hold of, just being really careful. Y'all, I don't do podcast series until I feel like the Lord has said, go. This is the word that I want you to get out now. I don't write books before publishers are like, okay, we're ready for your next book. I'm like, well, God has not said it yet. So we're not moving forward with this. So that would be kind of the spiritual side. With the practical side, I would say one of the greatest lessons that I've learned is to really know your team. And I mean that in a way of not just knowing okay, what's your Enneagram number? What are your strength finders? But know what their life looks like. So I have a girl that does some work for me and she's got a younger child. And so sometimes I know okay, I need to think back to what life was like with me when I was trying to work and had a little child at home. And then I've got a young college girl that's working for me. And so, her life looks totally different too. And so remembering that, as a leader, yeah, we got to get stuff done. We need to have systems and processes, but we also need to love our people really well and make sure that their hearts are good and their souls are in a good place. So I spend a lot of time with my team, and some people would say, well, that's a waste of time. But we spend a lot of time just talking about hey, what's your life looking like right now? And that helps me to know as I'm planning out the future, hey, I might need to bring on another person because she's in the thick of it with a 2-year-old right now. And she might not have that capacity to do that. But on the flip side of that, also I've learned to ask over assume. Always ask over assume. I don't know if you guys get this ever, but sometimes my friends will go have lunch without me and I'll be like, why did y'all invite me? Not I'm mad or bitter, but I'm just why did y'all think to invite me? And they're like, we just know how busy you are. And we just know that you just have too much going on and we didn't want to put one more thing on your plate. And I hate when people make assumptions like that because I'm you know what? I understand that. And I know how that perception comes across, but ask. And so that's something that I've learned as well, is just to ask over assume.
Oh, I just love those. They're so perfect and practical. And I love that leading from knowing your people. Like, what do my people need right now? And I think it definitely ties to what you said, ask rather than assume. Like, I think we come into leadership with so many assumptions and we move forward in those same assumptions without actually asking the people that we're leading what they need, how they receive feedback, any of those type of super practical things. So I just really love that. I'm wondering if in your journey and as you've been growing as a leader, if you've had any impact or had any mentors, that have impacted the way that you lead, and sort of what were the things that really were pivotal for you in those mentor relationships?
Mm-hmm. I love this question, Holly. And somebody else just recently asked me, and they wanted to know who my mentors were. And it's so weird because I would never actually call up these people and be like, hey, you're my mentor. I need to ask you about this. Isn't that so weird? How we put this weird thing on mentorship. But I started thinking about it and I was like, well, here's the people that I let speak into my process. Okay. So obviously being a part of Proverbs 31 Ministries, I'm surrounded by some of the greatest voices that have ever spoken in this generation. And so in my early days, Lisa Turkers was a huge, I would say, mentor to me, but I don't know that if you asked her, were you a mentor to Nicki Koziarz, that she would ever say, yeah, absolutely I was, because we never had that whole, here, will you sign my being a mentor contract? It's really just a place where as a writer and as a speaker, when I'm struggling with something, she's been a go-to person for me over the last decade. Okay. So I kind of have my author mentors, my speaking mentors. And then as far as biblical wisdom and leadership in that capacity, there's a woman, her name is Krista Williams. And you may never know Krista Williams because Krista is she is a behind the scenes girl. She does not want to be on the front cover of a magazine or on, a best-selling list or anything like that. Her heart is to really just sit with women who are in leadership and who are writing and speaking and to really make sure they understand the word of God. So when I'm struggling with something about, a passage I'm studying or even a parenting issue that I just really need some godly wisdom, she's my go-to person. But listen, as a first generation farmer, you better believe I also have mentors that I go to. I think about my friend Denise when something's wrong with one of my horses. She's the first one that I call and I listen to whatever she has to say. So I think something that's important to think about with mentorship is that we don't have to make it this official thing where we meet every single month for coffee and I tell you every detail of my life and you speak into it. It really can just be that picking up the phone and saying, hey, you're way better at this than me. And I need you to show me something that I can't see right now.
Mm-hmm. Such a good reminder about mentorship. Yeah. And I know a lot of the mentors that I have, they don't know that they're my mentor, right? It's that distance, but it's also good when you have some in real life too. So thank you for sharing about your experience with that. So Nicki, as we talk to leaders on this podcast, we know that most leaders have some kind of message to share and that God has given them something in their heart that they feel, like you said, that they want to impact other people with that message. So could you share a little bit about how you developed that desire to share a message and maybe when that took place and how that has kind of grown over the years for you?
Absolutely. I'll just share very briefly. I had a really bad experience in the church, and I know it's a really hot topic right now to talk about church hurt, and I'm not trying to jump on that train or anything like that. I want to disclaimer that I love the church. We need the church. We need to be building up the church. Let me just say that. But 20 years ago, the church was not what it is today. And I was actually an intern on staff at a church and found myself just as shocked as anybody the day that I found out that I was pregnant before I was married, and went through an extremely heartbreaking situation with the leadership, had some horrific things done that I won't get into, but you just need to know it was really bad. And I would think most people probably wouldn't ever step foot back in the church after experiencing some of the things that I experienced. But the Lord was very kind to me in that season. And that's the word that I would use to describe his character towards me, and allowed me to develop a spirit of perseverance, to not give up. And so here's the crazy thing. My husband and I got married. We actually stayed in the church that we were at, despite all of the hurt. And I began to notice that there were a lot of other women who were very hurt in the church. So I wasn't in a place where I was like, oh, well, let's do a Bible study or something like that. Like, I didn't even really know. I mean, I was 20. Like, I didn't know who Beth Moore was. I didn't know any of that stuff, right? I was just trying to make it through the day. And so I was talking to one of my friends one afternoon, and she was like, hey, I think you know more about the Bible than I do. Like, let's just get together and let's just talk about this. And I was like, I don't know anything about the Bible either, but let's sit down together and figure this out. Well, y'all, before I knew it, I had 50 women sitting in my living room. And it wasn't like I was like promoting it on the community website, like, let's do a Bible study. And it was the most messed up women that you could ever imagine. And the theology in the room was horrific. Like, I think about this guy, Joel Muddamalle, who helps at Proverbs. Like, if he had been sitting in that room, I mean, his head would have been spinning. But the crazy thing was that the Lord, like, in that moment, I became a leader of broken people. Like, they were looking to me to help lead them through this place. And so that Bible study just kept growing. And then one day I had to actually find somewhere else for the group to meet because it was too big. And so I went with fear and trembling to our women's ministry leader at the church. And I knew she knew my story. I knew she knew who I was. And I was like, hey, I've been having this little Bible study at my house and it's gotten too big. Can we meet here? And I mean, she was a redemptive part of my story. She was like, absolutely. She's like, I mean, you can't teach your own material, but you absolutely can have one of our rooms and come meet here. And so she handed me this stack of books. And in that stack of books was one of Lisa Turker's book. And I had never heard of her, didn't know she was in Charlotte, didn't know anything about her. And I remember opening up and reading her story about abortion. And I was like, hold on a second. Like, you don't have to actually be perfect for God to use you and to be a leader and to be called out. And so it was in those very early years of sitting in my living room that God developed this passion for gathering up women who didn't have it all figured out and learning to grow. Now, the process was a lot longer and more complicated than that, obviously, to where I am today, but that's really how it got started.
I love that you talk about this redemptive story and how you had this view of what leadership was before, and how walking through that has created this new idea of what leadership is. And I'm wondering if, we think about it as though leaders need to have it all together, right? And so we lead out of our brokenness, but then there's this part where does our brokenness hurt other people? And so I feel like there's a line there. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that line, where that is between not having it all together, being a broken person, and yet not getting our filth on other people.
Yes. And that is such an important conversation right now, especially because this topic is so hot within our culture. I think there's a difference between speaking in the midst of brokenness and speaking on the other side of brokenness. Yeah. Now, listen, when I talk to you about my church hurt, my heart still aches. Like, there's still something in me that's like, oh, when I see those people, like, I just had to see a couple of them a couple weeks ago at something. And I was like, still stings just a little bit. Okay. Yeah. But the reality is, I don't approach this conversation from let me tell you exactly what happened to me and why this was so bad and why this was so messed up and why this person should be punished and you should cancel them and things like that. That's really the bad side of talking about our brokenness. But when you share your stories of brokenness to a place and from, I really think it's a motive, Holly, right? Like, it's the why behind why you're doing it. So I share my story so that the woman sitting in the audience who also got pregnant before she was married and didn't have the best experience in the church, or for the addict who has felt like they were shamed and condemned and judged, they would look at my story and say, okay, she stayed and she stayed faithful and God was able to redeem this story. And if God can do it for her, God can do the same thing for me. And that's what I love about leadership, right? Like, we don't have to be envious or jealous or compare of anyone's quote unquote redemptive story, because if God did it for them, he will also do it for us if we're willing to go through that process with him. So I think it's got to be a motivation question. Like, why are we sharing what we're sharing? What's the reason? What's the purpose behind this?
I think that's so important to point out, because do you have a bone to pick still? You know what I mean? Like, are you on a crusade to fix the church? Because really that's not your place. Your place is to submit yourself to God and let him fix you and encourage others to do the same and grow more like Christ. And that's his problem, right? Like, and so I love the fact that you talk about motivation, because I think sometimes we get so worked up to tell our story that we don't check that first. And we don't see like, what's the point of this? What am I trying to do here? And who am I trying to, what am I trying to motivate people to do? Right? Like, is it to bring their brokenness to God as well? Or is it for them to cancel this specific thing about the church or this specific person? So I love that you talk about that. I want to talk about your most recent book that you've written called Flooded, about some difficult circumstances that you faced in your life and sort of how those impacted you. I'm wondering if you could kind of share a little bit about the book, and we'll kind of dive into that a little bit.
Yes, Flooded, the 5 best decisions to make when life is hard and doubt is rising, is based on the life of Noah. And I walk a reader through just some of the hard parts of Noah's story that I think sometimes we overlook. And the fact that Noah was a very human, he was very, very human. And humans have emotions, and humans have feelings, and humans have stories, and humans have places where we need to see God help us rise above our own doubt. And so I walk the reader through very lightly in the book. In the Bible study, I actually take the reader at a much deeper level through the scriptures. So there's a study guide that goes with it. If that's your thing, you want to dig into those scriptures, we do it in that study guide, but not so much in the book. The book is just kind of an overview of Noah's process. And yeah, I do share a lot of the hard situations. And, you know, Holly, this kind of connects back to what we were just talking about before, because mostly every story that I shared in Flooded was a very new story. And I wrestled with whether or not it was time to tell my brother specifically. For those of you that don't know, my brother committed suicide right before the pandemic hit. And it was he was a drug addict for 10 years and battled bipolar. And it was a very hard thing. And I sat with the Lord for a long time, and I fought with it. Like, y'all, even before I hit send on it, I was like, I'm scared right now. Like, I'm scared of what this is going to open up. And the Lord was just so firm. My brother was a Christian, and I do believe that he had the gift of preaching on him. And pre all of his struggles, he was a man who really believed that God works all things out for the good. And, you know, even when I started to share my story early on, you know, he was very supportive of that. And I felt like it was the best way to honor him, you know, like to tell his story and to say, like, here's the other side of what happens when someone does this. Because I know now that he's healed and whole with Jesus, and he would never want another person to experience that. And he would never want someone else to walk through that, because that's what Jesus does. When we get to heaven, it's all redeemed and restored. So yeah, I had to sit with that for a while and really had to, you know, have the all clear from the Lord that it was time to share that. But it was very timely. You know, suicide has been up astronomically in the last year from COVID, especially with young people. And I tell you, almost every day, an email pops into my inbox or my DMs of someone saying like, hey, I'm struggling with suicide, and this helps me understand, like, I don't want that for my life. And, or I've heard from other people who have said, I lost my mom, I lost my brother, I lost my sister to suicide. Thank you for speaking out on this and for opening up this discussion for others.
Well, first of all, I just want to say how sorry I am for that experience. I truly can't imagine going through that. And I agree that it's something that does need to be talked about, you know, in the church, especially because there's often such a sense of shame for the family around it. Would you be willing to share about that, if that's something that you can relate to or that you've experienced?
Oh, for sure. Like, I remember when I was sitting on the plane to go, my brother was in Seattle, and I live in Charlotte. And so clear on the other side of the country, right? I remember sitting on the plane and knowing that he was on life support. He had taken an entire bottle of Tylenol PM, and the doctor's words just rang in my ear. I don't even know that you're going to make it in time. And I remember sitting there on the plane thinking, who can I trust with this right now? Because like someone could really use this against me right now. And it was those handful of those mentors and those people that I knew that I could trust in that moment to pray me through that. And I didn't share right away that my brother died from suicide. I didn't. I was very much like, oh, this is so hard. And he's got kids. And, him and his wife had been separated for a long time and divorced. And it was a very ugly ending. But it was hard for me to sit with that shame. But the more that I started to when I remember telling the first person, it was my friend Christy, I was like, Christy, it was suicide. Like the doctor told me he did this. And I think just sitting there listening to the doctor say it to me was different than seeing it on paper or on his death certificate. It was a very real moment. But yeah, I remember thinking, I don't want to tell anybody this. I don't want this to be part of my story. I had just lost my mom to a brain tumor and it was awful. And I only had one brother. And so before I was even 40 years old, half of my family is gone. And in such tragic ways, right? It's not like someone just died from old age or, just so tragic, all of it. But I do think especially right now, because of this conversation about mental illness in the church and that we're trying to really find tools and resources to help people. I know it feels scary. I want to speak to just that one person who's listening right now. I know it feels scary to speak it and to say it, but the more that we say it and we call it what it is, it's straight from the pit of hell. And, we really decide that we're going to be advocates for people with mental illness. That's when we start to see the verse in Romans that talks about God working all things together for his good. Even something so bad and so tragic, God can still use in a good way for his kingdom.
It's so true. I just appreciate what you've shared. And I agree with just the need to share, to speak it out. We talk a lot about this concept of bringing things into the light. When we share, when we tell another person, I think it's like that scripture that talks about confess your sins one to another. That's where healing happens. I think that's not just limited to sin, but limited to anything that we share with another person. There's power in that God can use that when we open that up. So I appreciate you opening up and sharing about that very painful part of your life. One of the things that often happens when we go through something like this, that's just unexplainable, losing your mom, losing your brother in such a short period of time, it often leads to doubt. And, that's part of what you address in the book. So I'd love to have you share, how can we navigate this issue of doubt? Even those of us who maybe grew up in the church and we have strong faith, we still might find ourselves facing a time that we're questioning God, questioning if he's there, questioning if he cares about us. So how do we navigate that issue?
Well, one of the things that I always say as a Bible teacher that it might discredit me a little bit, but I'm fine with it because it'll get me on level ground with somebody. One of the things that I do personally when I'm struggling with a sin struggle, and unbelief is totally a sin struggle, it's just that quiet, acceptable sin struggle that nobody ever calls out, right? There's not going to be a whole hashtag movement, doubt is sin. Nobody's going to do that. But I like to get behind people in the scriptures who are just a little bit more messed up than me. Let's just be honest, okay? And there are some seriously messed up people in the scriptures. And I think we try to turn them into these heroic people. And I'm reading their stories. I'm like, there's no heroic thing about this. Now, Noah, absolutely. There was many heroic things about him, but Rachel and Leah, that whole battle of comparison and the nastiness and everything, there was nothing heroic about either one of them. So that's for me personally, because I think sometimes we're looking for counselors and pastors and mentors, which are great, right? But the thing that we have to remember is that for every human struggle, there's already been another human who has walked through it in the scriptures. Suicide is in the scriptures. This is not nothing we're going through right now is a new human struggle. And so we just have to go back and study the people who went through something and see what we can learn from them. Now, this is not a posture. I want to be careful because some people would say, well, that's making the Bible all about you. And it's not, because if it was making it about me, then I would be inserting myself into the story and saying, well, if I was Noah, I would have built the ark this way. And if I was God, I would have done this. And if me. But no, it's Noah, teach me what you learned. show me through the scriptures, Holy Spirit, what these people experienced and how they got to this place. I mean, like, I understand that everything in the scriptures is supposed to point us to the story of God and point us to the character of God and reveal God's character. And God's character is one of redemption, and he wants to see us as humans redeemed. And so, whether you're struggling with doubt, fear, anxiety, depression, like, it's all in the scriptures. And so obviously, my number one thing to that is, like, let's go to the scriptures and see who can teach us. Okay. But then on the flip side, kind of the more practical side of that, in the book, I talk about decision making a little bit, not like decision about what should I do for the rest of my life. But I realized that through Noah's process, y'all, this was so interesting. Not one time in the very beginning of the biblical account of Noah do we ever see him say a word, right? Nothing until the very end of his story, which he actually speaks blessings and curses in the same breath, which we are not to do today. But I realized that there was this pattern. God commanded, Noah obeyed. God commanded, Noah obeyed. Okay, so obedience is ultimately a decision, right? Like, we have to decide, like, we're not puppets that God's moving around and telling us what to do and where to go and who to be and all these things. Like, he gives us that freedom. And so these 5 decisions in the book that I talk about, I'll just real quickly share one that's my absolute favorite. The one that I go to all the time is to remember that God is in charge. And that's a really hard thing to do when life feels out of control and doubt is starting to rise up in our brains, because we want to take control, right? We want to take hold of it. We want to do whatever we can do to fix this problem. But, kind of shifting from that whole, I don't know how old you guys are. It might be older than you, but I grew up in that whole, like, God is in control, kind of singing those songs every Sunday. And I'm not about to say something theologically incorrect, because in essence, God is sovereign. He does see over everything. He knows everything, but God is in charge of the plan, and we're in control of our obedience. And that's what Noah teaches us. And so every struggle, whether it's doubt or fear or anxiety, we got to take it through that lens. God's in charge of the plan, but I'm in control of my obedience.
I love that. I think that sometimes we play such a victim when it comes to that. Like, this is my circumstance and I don't have a decision I can make. I don't have an option. These are the things that I have to do because, this has been inflicted upon me. And I think one of the things that we need to remember is that we do have decision-making power, like what you're talking about, our own free will. And we always, always, always have the option to obey what God is telling us to do, no matter what the situation looks like. And so I love that. You mentioned the 5 decisions in your book. Would you mind just kind of running through those really quickly, like what they are? Not in super depth, but I would just love to know what those 5 decisions are that you talk about.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so decision number 1 that we see Noah make, that we can also make when life is hard and doubt is rising, is to walk with God. Okay, and then that sounds really simple, but it's actually a lot harder than it sounds. Then we see decision number 2, and decision number 2 is to listen to God. And that leads us back into that place of obedience. Like, actually listening doesn't mean just hearing. It means actually doing what God has said that we're supposed to do. And then decision number 3 is to rise above the doubt. And that is also a decision, because doubt enters our mind and we have to decide, am I going to rise above this right now, or am I going to let this entertain my whole day today? Decision number 4 is to remember that God is in charge, the one that I just talked about. And then decision number 5 is to remember to find the familiar faithfulness of God. And I love that decision too, because I love all the decisions, like asking which one is your favorite kid, right? I love that one because when doubt is like consuming us and swarming us, it can make us feel like we just never experience God's faithfulness, right? Like, we kind of get into that like Eeyore kind of mindset that it's just always going to be bad. And it's always going to be hard. And it's always going to be full of doubt. But we have to look back and remember that God has been faithful before and he will be faithful again.
That's so helpful. And I love that. And I know if people want to learn more about these, they can definitely grab the book and read, and we'll make sure the link is in the show notes. But I'd love to hear how making these decisions for you helped you to respond to your own doubt and your own, feeling of kind of like life being out of control. Are there any practical examples you'd want to share of how making these decisions impacted your own doubt?
Decision number one is one that probably challenged me the most, right? And it sounds the simplest, to walk with God. Like these decisions, I did not write them in a way that was to sound like I played with the wording. I was like, maybe I should be poetic. Maybe I should be like super, theologically like deep. And the Lord was like, no, like, I don't know about you guys, but the past year, it's been back to the basics for me. Like everything in my life, like, let's just get back to the basics. Let's just make it simple. And so the wording is really simple, right? But we see this decision number one come out because it says in Genesis chapter 5, verse 8, it says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And then it says, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And, I kind of have this not so funny joke right now, but there's another verse that talks about in Matthew that when Jesus returns, that it would be as it is and as it was in the days of Noah, right? And so kind of right now, like every time I open up my newsfeed, I'm like, oh my word, here we go, as it was in the days of Noah. Or, if someone does something that I'm just like, what? As it was in the days of Noah, right? Like it's become this like my version of, oh, bless your heart, right? What we talk about here in the South. But when I think about this idea of what it means to be one person set apart in a generation, I'm so intrigued about what this really means to walk with God. And this is not like, let me go take my dog for a walk, or let me go, for a walk around the block. Like it is a step-by-step movement with God. And my friend Elle was talking to me the other day. She was like, and we were talking about what her process was like. And she was like, Nicki, every day I actually invite Jesus to walk with me the whole day. Like that was so simple, but it was so mind blowing. I was like, I don't know that I've ever done that. I don't know that I've ever said, Jesus, come walk with me today. Like put my steps literally so close to yours that I can't get one way off the direction and feel like I'm not next to you anymore. Like, can you imagine what our lives would look like if we really did that every single day? We walked so closely. But the other thing about, learning to walk with God so that we can be like Noah, where, we see that word favor, right? And that's such a messed up theological word in our heads because we adjoin favor with favorite, right? And so we think if I'm showing favor to Esther, or if I'm showing favor to Holly, that somehow one of you are my favorites, right? And that's not what it means to walk in God's favor. Like we are all God's favorites. He wants all of us to walk closely with him. But the reality is, in this generation today, we're seeing this left and right. Man, we need some more people to say, Jesus, come walk with me. Come walk with me so that I can keep walking with you, so that I can remember you're in charge of the plan, but I'm in control of my obedience, and my steps prove my obedience to Christ.
That's really helpful. And I think one of the things that I'm thinking about is what you said earlier about this issue of church hurt. And like sometimes it seems like people who have been hurt in the church, that hurt often leads to doubt. It often leads to not wanting to be involved in the church, not being willing to reach out. And so it sounds to me like part of how we can move forward is to open up those conversations about doubt, about hurt, about the challenges that people are facing, and looking at how is God leading us into new ways of reaching those people, right? Because those people need to be ministered to, need to be reached. And some of the things we've been doing maybe haven't been doing the job.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's, trust has to be built back up, and trust is a really hard thing. And I think sometimes pride can say, well, I'm not the one who broke the trust.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the one who messed this conversation up. And so we can just kind of take that high and mighty stance and like, no, like, I want to apologize on behalf of the church. If you've been hurt, I am so sorry. And that should not have happened to you. And if you have wounds, I want to have wounds with you, and I want to walk with you, and I want to sit with you, and I want to heal you. Now, I do think that there's a time, like we can't just sit and just sulk and, be in this place. Like there does have to be a shifting point where we say, okay, like healing is a process and healing is a movement. And so we've got to start taking some steps towards that. And so, I think as leaders, we start looking at our systems. How can I build a better system so that people can trust me as a leader? How can I live my life and show people my life so that they know, like, remember what I said in the beginning, like, I want people to look at me and know Nicki is a woman. I may not agree with her. I may not love her all the time. I may not think her animals are as cute as she does, but I know at the end of the day, Nicki is a woman who listens to God. And so I trust her, what she's saying here.
So, you shared kind of an encouragement to the woman who maybe has been hurt by the church. And I think it's this combination of take the time to heal, experience the healing, but also don't let that stop you from moving forward in your relationship with God, right? But what would you say to those who are leaders? Maybe they're leaders in their church, maybe they're leaders in their community, whatever it might be, but they're leading someone who is hurting, who has been hurt, or who maybe is experiencing doubt. What are some ways that we can respond to those people in a better way, in a healthier way, in our churches and in our organizations?
That's a good question. And here's what just came to my mind, and this may not be what you're looking for, but I think with people's pain and with their doubt, we need to stop trying to make sense of God. Okay. So when I was experiencing the loss of my brother and the loss of my mom, and even the loss of my church, like there was just that people just say things, even godly people, they just say things and they're like, oh, well, God did answer your prayers, Nicki, like just not the way that you were praying and hoping and believing. But maybe this is what God was doing. And maybe that's what God is doing. And like, I just want to say, like, as leaders, I know it's really hard because like people are looking to us for answers and wisdom, but sometimes we just need to look at them and go, this makes no sense. It makes no sense. And I'm not going to try to make sense of it. I'm going to just sit with you in this pain and I'm going to help you feel like you're not alone in this and, walk through this. Now, another thing that I think is very practical side of this, going back to that conversation about getting back to the basics. I think as pastors and as leaders and as communicators, we need to get back to a place where we're just teaching people what the word says. And, we've tried to do all these things, these fancy sermon series and these, all these creative elements, which I love them all, right? They're awesome. But man, I don't know, this last year, I'm like, just teach me what the Bible says. Just tell me, I don't want to know your opinion about this. Just tell me what the word of God says and be done with it, right? Like, I think we have overcomplicated so much of this. So like, let the Lord speak through your words and make sure that, you're really coming at this from a posture of, I've listened to God, I've humbled myself before God, and this is what I feel like God's saying to us through this struggle right now.
I feel like that is, it feels like salve to my soul because there's so many people that have gone through things and they've had people say those really terrible things to them. And sometimes it just feels like you want someone to come up to you and go, this is terrible. Eye to eye, whatever it is, like, I'm sorry, this is awful. And honestly, when I've been going through hard things, that is probably one of the most pivotal things for me because I feel like some of those other things that we say to placate people, they just feel like oppression almost. Like I have to fall under this mindset and I have to just agree with you because the things that you're saying feel like they're probably true. And if I disagree with you, then I'm not going to look like as good of a Christian as you are. And it doesn't bring the healing and the freedom that we need. We get eye to eye with people and sit with them. And we don't have to have the answers. We can just say, this is terrible. What is God saying? This is terrible. What does the Bible say? What has he already given to us? And just walk with people through that. So I just love that you've said that. One of the things that you kind of talked about and kind of switching gears a little bit was, how COVID was this huge upheaval for a lot of things. And you were talking about getting back to the basics and perhaps the habits and routines that we had before look totally different now. And so I'm just wondering what in this new season has been a habit or a routine that has helped you stay healthy as a leader, or that has helped you kind of circle back to those simple things that we need to be remembering?
So I don't know what part of the country you guys live in, but, we're in the South. And so the South was definitely opened up way earlier than the rest of the country. And I know there's all kinds of opinions about that. So like the going to church part, I mean, it was really just only a couple of months, right? Where we really, and we actually, something really neat, we ended up having a small church out here on our farm for a couple of weeks. And so like that corporate worship, I felt it in the very beginning for sure. But I know there's other parts of the country and even like Canada that are still not being able to go to church. And so I think one of the greatest things that you can do is to get back into a corporate setting. God never designed the church to be behind computer screens. Now, listen, Proverbs 31 Ministries is an online ministry. Like we've been doing this forever. Like we were doing it before it was cool, right? But so I have seen what can happen in online ministry and lives are changed and, people who can't get to church and things like that, 100%. But man, y'all, we got to get back into a rhythm. It makes me so mad when we in our town, when I go out, like we'll go out to dinner and I know there's a shortage of staff right now across the nation, like unemployment is really high. And so, it's nothing now to wait an hour for dinner, whereas before we just walk right in, right? But it makes me so mad on Saturday nights to see people standing outside for hours, waiting to eat in a restaurant. But man, and then I go into church on Sunday and it's like, we're not even close to being back at capacity. And so that's really discouraging. So I just want to say, like, I think that's a good habit that we need to get back into is, when you can. I know there's different parts and different things going on across the country, but even if it's just you sitting face to face with one or two other people and opening the word of God, we've got to get back into that. One thing that for me, that God really, I'll just be very vulnerable. That is very humbling. This is 2021, 2022, all of COVID, right? So 2019 was the busiest speaking year that I have ever had to this date. I had 40 events in one year. It was a lot. It may be too much. Okay. But I realized how much of my identity was wrapped up in that and how much I hated being still. Like I would sit here and cry when the emails started coming through about canceling this, canceling that. And I would hold my breath. Okay, but wait, there's still one more in April. Maybe that one's going to come through. And then boom, 25 events just wiped out like that. And instead of like rushing and going, okay, I'm going to do an online conference. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. Like, I let God chisel me away in that moment. And I realized like how much of my purpose was tied into, and it was a good purpose, right? Like nobody would ever look at that and go, oh, well, that was a bad thing you were out doing. Like, no, I was out preaching the gospel and people were getting saved and, amazing things were happening. And so, I've had to try really, really hard to make sure, like when I get back out there now that things are coming back in and, people are starting to request me again, like to not overpack my schedule because my identity is somehow wrapped in that and my purpose is somehow tied to that. Because I promise you, like, the way God uses me to speak to 1,000 women is the same way God uses me to sit at my table with my family. And we can't get those out of balance because it gets really messy in our souls.
Yeah. Such a good word as we're getting close to wrapping up, Nicki. I just appreciate that and that vulnerability because it's scary to say that, but I think a lot of leaders struggle with the issue of identity and being that closely connected to what we do and the things that the world sees us do as who we are, and we have to find a way to separate those. So I would love if you could share, Nicki, what would you say to a younger leader, maybe just as one piece of advice or encouragement to her as she's going into leadership, getting started in the earlier years? What would you say to her?
I love that question, Esther. I would say, always remember that everyone has something to teach you. And sometimes that person teaches you who you never want to become as a leader. And I remember in my very early days of ministry, sometimes I would I would have to be under a leader for this project or that project or whatever. And I would think about the way that they would treat me, especially because I was young. I didn't know anything. And I remember thinking, I will never treat a younger leader this way ever. And I also remember like the first time I ever got some really negative feedback about my writing from another person. And it wasn't the kind of feedback that makes you better. It was just mean. And I remember thinking, I will never do this to another person. So I think that's one of the greatest lessons in leadership, and just stay humble. Just stay humble. The Lord honors those who remain in that posture of humility. And you may feel like right now you're the one cheering everybody on and you're supporting them to help them fulfill their dreams. But one day they will come back behind you and they'll be cheering you on and supporting you.
Such good advice. So one of the things that we'd like to ask all of our guests that come on is, we know that they have probably good resources that they're diving into and that they're learning from. So I'd love to know what book or podcast or something that you're listening to or reading that you're learning about right now. What's that thing that's really impacting you right now that you could share with our audience?
So I am constantly consuming a lot of content. I love John Maxwell. He is one of my favorite leaders. So I'm constantly on his YouTube channel, consuming everything that he is teaching about leadership. But this is something that might surprise you. Okay, well, wait, one other person. Dr. Tony Evans has a new study Bible out right now that I think every leader needs to have. It is incredible. And so you can find that on Amazon. It's very worth the investment because it just really helps you as a leader know how to connect with your people in a very real and practical way. Because sometimes as communicators, it can get a little over spiritualized in our head. We got to bring it back down. And he does an excellent job of doing that. But I listen to a lot of secular content. And I know this surprises people sometimes because they're like, you shouldn't do that. Like, you should only let Christians speak into your process. And I don't. I kind of live my life in that posture of everyone has something to teach me. Now, I don't go necessarily to these people for Bible wisdom. Remember going back to that mentor conversation, you got to know where to go with that. So I love Evan Carmichael. I don't know if you guys know him, but he has a really popular YouTube channel where he brings on pretty much anyone who's ever done anything. And I love watching his videos, and he pulls out the lessons that these leaders and entrepreneurs and speakers have learned. So he's great. I love him. But again, not for biblical content. Go to Dr. Tony Evans for that. John Maxwell for your spiritual wisdom and leadership. But yeah, I really love Evan Carmichael.
I just love that you mentioned that because we sometimes have conversations on this podcast with people that we don't always necessarily agree with 100%. And there's times when I feel like, there's almost like this expectation in Christian circles that you only associate with people that you agree with, and you only listen to or hear from people that you agree with. And my response is, how do we grow and actually learn how to communicate what we believe if we don't ever hear anything different?
Exactly.
So I love that you shared that you do listen to other content and that, you use discernment in that process. So as we wrap up, Nicki, I would love for you to share how people can connect with you. What's the best way for them to learn more about what you're doing? And if you have any free gift or anything like that on your website, feel free to share that as well.
Well, I think I'm the easiest person to find on the internet because I'm everywhere. So anywhere you would go, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest. I'm on TikTok. I'm not doing TikTok really. I've done it a couple times, but you can find me lurking on there. But yeah, I'm anywhere at Nicki Koziarz. And you can also head to my website, nickikoziarz.com. And I have a whole section of freebies that you can hop on there and download all kinds of neat things. One of the things that's really hot right now is we have this free resource called the 8 Spiritual Disciplines. And I walk people through what those disciplines are and where we see them in the scripture. And people have been really interested in that. So yeah, it's all at nickikoziarz.com.
Thank you, Nicki, for being here today. I've so enjoyed this conversation, and I think that it has been challenging and vulnerable and all these really great things all wrapped into one. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and just being vulnerable with us and sharing from your heart.
Esther and Holly, thank you so much for having me on. This was a great conversation, and y'all are really good at your jobs. I love it.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Women Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, come and join us in our private Facebook community. We would love to get to know you better so that we can make sure the podcast is providing what you need. Plus, you can share your questions and ideas, and you'll be surrounded by incredible Christian women leaders. To join the group, visit estherlittlefield.com/group. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters. and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.